Once you thought of the nutshell technique, you sat down and watched these 100+ movies and wrote in these notebooks. When did you actually write the book?
So I created the method and I started using it right away with my clients and students in workshops. And I had been doing it for probably about 5 years. And my students kept telling me, you've got to write a book, you got to write a book. And then somebody from the University of Texas Press happened to take my workshop and said, there's nothing like your method out on the bookshelves. And I said, I know. And he said, you should write a book proposal. And so I did. And so that's how the book came about.
Interesting. And so you kind of put yourself in a whole new realm, is that right? Because now you're writing an outline or you're querying publishers, or did Texas Press just go ahead and say, this is it, we love what you did? Did you have to go through this whole process?
I did go through the process. I didn't approach others. At the time I was known, I didn't have a huge name as a script consultant, so I didn't query other publishers. I just went, but I did write a proposal for University of Texas Press. It had to go through that process. I have to say, writing the proposal was really hard. I really had to chain myself. I discovered myself having to chain myself to my desk to do the proposal. And I was really concerned, if I get this book deal, is the book going to be as unpleasant as writing the proposal? Because writing the proposal, I don't know what it was about it, but it was super unpleasant. And luckily it wasn't. The book was much more pleasant. I think it's because in the book, it's kind of similar to what happens with your screenwriters. When you're doing the proposal, it's a little bit like the beginning phases where you're doing the structural planning for, when you're creating a nutshell for a screenplay. I describe it to my students and clients as, you're spending a lot of writing days where you're kind of going, and you're not typing anything, right? Because you're doing all this plotting in your head, and I find it really unpleasant, that thinking phase, because you want to write, but you need to think through these parts. And the book proposal was kind of similar to that, where it was like, oh, should I do it this way? Should I figure out how to structure the book? Because it was very carefully structured in the end, where I have trying to figure out having the nutshell diagrams in the back and having them have a method where it's, when I refer to different nutshells in the book, I use underline to indicate that it's going to reflect in the diagrams in the back. And it took a long time to figure that out, how exactly, and I kind of flip-flopped a little bit in developing the proposal of how to do this book. So it was not a pleasant process, but luckily the writing the book was pleasant.
I was curious how that was for you. So once you got sort of the green light to go ahead and write this book, did you have a deadline that you had to have the first draft?
Yeah. And that was one of the reasons I was really glad I was working with a publisher versus going self-published. And I think a lot of writers will relate to this, and a lot of screenwriters, I'm terrible when I don't have a hard deadline. I find it much more motivating and much more helpful to have a firm deadline, because you don't get to make excuses, So I think that's, the lesson to screenwriters. You got to find, even if it's an artificial deadline, even if it's in order to enter to a competition, or it's with a writing group, some sort of deadline, because if it's open-ended, you'll take forever. So I gave myself a 6-month deadline to write the book. I knew that if I had given myself a year, I would have taken a year. But if I only gave myself 6 months, I would do it in 6 months, and that's what I did.
And so was one of the requirements they see the full first draft, or did they just want to see section by section, chapter by chapter?
The full thing, yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay. And they were okay with 6 months?
Yes.
Interesting. So then what once you knew this clock was ticking, what was your day like? Would you do it on weekends? Sounds fascinating.
I personally, I need to block out time in my calendar. It doesn't mean I'll stick to it, but I need to put it on the calendar. So I would put mornings, basically, 9 to, and I'm certainly not typing away all that whole time, but I would put, 9 to noon, Monday through Friday, unless I had something else I had to book then. I would try to schedule around that so that it was on the calendar. And I wasn't writing the entire time, but if it was on the calendar, that was the time that I blocked off for that. And I tried to move everything else around that.
And then did you go and do your own outline first? Did you
Yeah.
sort of chart it out? And how did you do that? It's fascinating.
Well, I mean, that was part of the book proposal. That was actually in the proposal that I found. I was actually planning how I structured the book. I didn't necessarily have to do it that way, but that's the way I did it. In the way I presented the proposal, it forced me to think about how I was going to organize the book. And I tried a couple different ways before I settled on the way I ended up doing it.
Which was you kind of came up with chapters first and then wrote or after?
Well, the idea being that of doing the idea of having all of the nutshell chapters, the nutshell diagrams in this back section, that was the piece I couldn't quite decide how to do. In the beginning, it was like, well, maybe every time we mention a movie, we then cut to a diagram of one of them. And then what I came up with was having it in its own section, and that we would flip back and forth between the two sections. But it took me a little while to come up with that. I also have a system where in the book I use underline. So when I kind of tried to structure it a little bit like my classes, where I'm trying to repeat and emphasize things in order to get points across. And so whenever and to illustrate my point, each of the chapters, for example, is on each of the elements of the nutshell. So we have I flipped randomly to the chapter on the catch. And so as I go through talking about the catch, and I'll talk about different movies, how the catch works, when I refer to one of the movies that's in the background, in the back section, and I'm quoting the catch that's in the nutshell, I used a technique where I underline that element to it so that you can see, so the reader can very easily see, and it indicates to them, oh, I could flip back. So I'm looking at, she's talking about the nutshell for Usual Suspects. If I want, I can flip back to here, the alphabetical nutshell section. I can find Usual Suspects, and then I can see when she quotes it and she's talking about the catch, that she's actually using the exact same wording here as I do there. So that was one very specific structural thing that I kind of came up in the development that I did during the proposal, and was not that was not the way I originally thought about doing the book. There were a couple different ways in trying to figure out how to do it.